I understand that State Senator from Virginia is seeking the floor, and I'll be glad to yield to him at this time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I thank my distinguished colleague and longtime friend, the senior senator from South Carolina. I've had the privilege of serving here in the Senate now and being my 16th year with Senator Thurmond, and we look upon him as a role model in many, many respects. And I enjoy so much my work with him on the Armed Services Committee. And each Tuesday when he addresses our caucus, he always raises subjects of interest to all and presents them in a very cogent manner. Mr. President, tonight I'd like to talk about several subjects which many senators, including myself, have been engaged in here in the past few days in the Senate. First subject involves the Safe Drinking Water Act. Under the leadership of Senators Baucus and Chafee, the Environment and Public Works Committee had a markup this week of this important piece of legislation. I had considerable doubt, as did other Republican senators on this committee, that we would achieve a bill and report it to the floor. But through the diligence and cooperation of all members of the committee on both sides of the aisle, we did achieve that goal and reported out a bill this past week, and I'd like to share with the Senate some of the highlights of this very important piece of legislation. There's not a one of us that does not desire that all America have the finest drinking water that's obtainable. The name of the act itself implies that desire, Safe Drinking Water Act. However, there's a number of economic concerns that must be faced by communities all across this country. 87% of the communities in America are under 10,000 people. And quite frankly, they cannot afford. They simply cannot afford. It's beyond the budgets of their communities to achieve certain standards. And that fact was taken into consideration by the committee in its work this week. So I'd like now to discuss the work of this committee, and I'll start off by giving a little history. In 1974, the Safe Drinking Water Act, PL 93523, was enacted to ensure that public drinking water systems throughout the nation provide water that is free of harmful contaminants. Previously, the Public Health Service set standards for drinking water which were used as a voluntary reference for drinking water systems. The Drinking Water Program was transferred to EPA when that agency was created in 1970. The SDWA requires EPA to establish drinking water regulations to protect public health. EPA establishes a, quote, maximum contaminant level goal. That's referred to as the MCLG, end quote, which is a level at which no known or anticipated effects on the health of persons occur and allows an adequate margin of safety. EPA then sets a, quote, maximum contaminant level, MCL, end quote, which is the enforceable level set as close to the goal as is feasible. Feasible means the application of the best available treatment technology, taking cost into consideration. The regulations apply to both privately and publicly owned systems which serve at least 25 people or 15 connections. There are approximately 60,000 community water systems in this country. There are another 140,000 non-community water systems, including hospitals, schools, and campgrounds that serve more than 25 people regularly and are regulated under the Act, as written in 1974. While the National Drinking Water Program is based on federal law, states have primary enforcement responsibility for implementing the Act within their borders. 55 of 50 in their borders. The Act authorizes EPA to provide grants to assist the states in developing their programs, funded at about $60 million, and that was the level of funding, Mr. President, in 1993. A key aspect of the drinking water program is the variability in size of drinking water systems. 80%, as I said, of the population receive their drinking water from large systems operated by major cities or private utilities. These systems can afford to monitor and to treat the water at a relatively small cost to consumers. There are a large number of very small systems serving only a few hundred people. 62%, this was the forecast in '74, 62% of systems serve less than 500 persons. These systems often lack sufficient resources and expertise to comply with the regulations. The available technology and monitoring requirements that EPA sets are established to reflect the capabilities of large systems, not the small ones. Now, let's look at the legislation since 1972. The Safe Drinking Water Act was last reauthorized in June of 1986, and appropriations are authorized through FY 91. The 86 amendments established a schedule for issuing additional MCLs. Many in Congress felt that the regulatory process should be streamlined and that EPA was not developing revised regulations quickly enough. In '86, only 23 contaminants had standards. Consequently, the 86 amendments redesignated the remaining 23 interim regulations as promulgated primary regulations and set a 3-year deadline for EPA to develop primary drinking water regulations for 83, including the 23 already regulated, specified contaminants. In addition, the 86 amendments required EPA to add 25 contaminants every 3 years after the standards for the initial 83 contaminants had been issued. In other words, progressively, through research, add the additional contaminants so as to further improve our water systems. The 86 amendments also created 2 new programs that focus on groundwater protection: grants for sole source aquifer demonstration and the Wellhead Protection Program. In the past several years, there has been growing controversy over the new drinking water regulations issued by the EPA and the cost of monitoring and treatment to meet these new regulations. Senator Lautenberg, member of the Environment Public Works Committee, a man who's taken a great deal of interest in the Superfund legislation, and I've worked with him on that, as I have on many other programs. Senator Lautenberg held a general oversight hearing on the Safe Drinking Water Act in May of 1991 to review progress in implementing the program and evaluate concerns about the costs of the program. In July of '92, the Senate passed a Chafee-Lautenberg second-degree amendment to a Domenici amendment addressing safe drinking water. The Domenici amendment would have suspended several promulgated drinking water standards and prevented EPA from issuing new standards until reauthorization of the Act. The Chafee-Lautenberg amendment called for a study of the whole Act, extended the deadline for radon in drinking water regulations, and reduced the requirement for monitoring in small systems from 4 times every 3 years to just once. Now, Mr. President, that invoked quite a considerable savings to these small communities. Small communities are quite anxious to comply, but again, it's a matter of economics. Oftentimes, the costs associated with complying under the various regulations of the Safe Drinking Water Act are as big as their whole budget for law enforcement, their whole budget for health care in their community, to the indigent and the poor. And therefore, we have to be very cautious as we mandate these regulations down on these small communities. And that's what we're doing now as we're working on a rewrite for this year of the Safe Drinking Water Act. In early '93, President Clinton proposed a major new initiative to establish state revolving loan funds called SRFs to help communities comply with drinking water standards, modeled after a similar loan program under the Clean Water Act and authorized at $600 million in FY93 and $1 billion per year in FY94 and 97. Last year, the Energy and Commerce and Public Works Committee in the House reported legislation authorizing drinking water loan funds. The HUD Appropriations Bill for FY94 reserved $600 million for the drinking water loan funds, pending enactment of legislation authorizing the funds. The HUD bill also extends the deadline for issuing the radon and drinking water standard until the end of '94, or the reauthorization of the Safe Drinking Water Act, or whichever occurs first. In September of 1993, EPA issued a major report to Congress on the drinking water program. The report reviews the key elements of the program and includes 10 major recommendations for changes to the Act. On October 14, 93, Senator Baucus introduced comprehensive legislation to amend the Safe Drinking Water Act, S. 1547. The bill authorizes the state loan funds, and that's the new feature, and makes significant changes to the regulatory provisions of the previous acts. The Environment and Public Works Committee held a hearing on the Act and the proposed legislation in October of last year, 1993. Now, drinking water issues and the Chairman's mark. A few comments on that. Drinking water systems and states argue that the cost of meeting the drinking water standards is an unfunded federal mandate. While the Clean Water Act provided funds to help communities meet clean water goals, the Drinking Water Act never included funding for meeting drinking water standards. Current law provides for grants to states to manage the program. The FY93 appropriation for state grants is $60 million. States argue that this is far less than they need to run the program. EPA estimates that states need an additional $162 million to cover program costs. Chairman Mark authorizes a SRF for drinking water at $600 million for '94 and $1 billion for FY95 through the turn of the century, 2000. States may use a percentage of the SRF to pay for program costs, 50% in '95, 100% in '96 through 1998, and 50% in '99. If a state lacks adequate funding, the EPA may withdraw delegation of the program and have authority to impose a federal drinking water fee to pay the cost of the program. In addition, the authorization level for the PWSS grants is increased from $40 million to $100 million. Now let's talk about the small systems, Mr. President. Many small systems face very high user charges when complying with the drinking water regulations because of the limited economies of scale. These systems argue that they need financial help to keep costs down or authority to reduce the expected treatment.
Could you use?
In addition, small systems argue that they are unable to afford or manage the monitoring requirements of the Act. The Chairman directs EPA to develop small system best available technology. Any system serving under 3,300 persons is eligible for a variance if, and I repeat, if,
They said it's.
I repeat that. In addition, small systems argue they are unable to afford or manage the monitoring requirements of the Act. The Chairman directs EPA to develop small system best available technology. Any system serving under 3,300 persons is eligible for a variance if it cannot afford to comply with current regulations through conventional treatment system restructuring or finding an alternative source of water. This determination is made by the state. A variance allows, come here. Mr. President, I see another senator.
Would the Senator of Virginia yield for the purpose of a question?
Yes, Mr. President, I see the distinguished colleague from Nebraska seeking to ask a question, and I yield for the purpose of a question without yielding the floor.
I would simply ask, as an accommodation to me, if the senator from Virginia, without losing his right to the floor, would recognize me for no more than 1 minute for the purpose of temporarily going to morning business for the purpose of introducing a bill, and then I would yield back to my friend from Virginia.
Mr. President, might I suggest that the senator just proceed to make his statement and it appear elsewhere in the record, but that we maintain for parliamentary purposes the current
I would so request.
I'm willing to hear the senator's question, and feel free to take more than a minute.
Mr. President, let the chair put that question so that it'll be clear on the record. Without objection, the senator from Virginia may yield to the senator from Nebraska for such time as the senator from Nebraska requires for the introduction of a bill as though in morning business, after which the senator from Virginia will resume his speech without its being charged as a second speech against him. Is there objection? Chair hears no objection.
Chair, for that ruling, I sit in complete confidence, having a particular presiding officer make that ruling.
Mr. President, and I thank the chair, and I thank my friend and colleague from Virginia for his usual courtesy. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed the consideration of going into morning business for a very brief period of time for the purpose of introducing legislation, and that the comments that I will make and the introduction of the bill be placed in an appropriate place in the record so as not to break the continuity of the remarks being made by the senator from Virginia.
Without objection, it is so ordered. Senator from Nebraska, Mr. Exon is recognized.
Mr. President, I am proud to introduce, by the request of the administration, the Amtrak Reauthorization Act. As chairman of the Senate Surface Transportation Subcommittee and a longtime advocate of the Amtrak system, this legislation represents an historic turning point in the history of American passenger rail service. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the balance of my remarks be printed into the record as if delivered, And
Without
I send
objection,
the bill to the desk and request that it be appropriately referred.
Without objection, it's so ordered. The bill will be received and appropriately referred.
I thank the chair, and I now ask for the close of morning business, and thank my friend from Virginia again for his courtesy.
Under the request that was previously granted, the Senator from Virginia, Mr. Warner, is again recognized.
Thank the distinguished colleague from Nebraska, and I also thank the chair for clearly ruling on this matter, such that I am now returning to my original speech. Mr. President, I'm going to digress from the comments I have on the Safe Drinking Water Act to a second subject that I worked on this week together with 43 other senators on this side of the aisle. Today, all 44 Republican senators are sending to the President of the United States the following letter, and I would like to read it. Dear Mr. President, we are writing regarding the negotiations that the administration has entered into on the future of the ABM Treaty and the potential impact that any resultant agreement might have on U.S. theater missile defense, that's TMD, programs. Paragraph. Over the last several years, the Senate has taken a very active role in promoting the resolution of this issue. The Missile Defense Act of 1991, a piece of legislation which I and several others had a hand in drawing up. That act, as amended, directs the executive branch to clarify the distinctions between permitted TMD systems and precluded ABM systems. During the Senate's consideration of the fiscal year 94 Defense Authorization Bill, this issue was again debated at great length. The Senate subsequently adopted a congressional finding, now codified in law, Section 234A7 of PL 103-160, that states that the ABM Treaty does not apply to the TMD systems unless such systems are tested against or have demonstrated capabilities to counter modern strategic ballistic missiles. As you know, there is an emerging consensus in the Senate that any agreement to substantively modify the ABM Treaty should be submitted by the administration for Senate advice and consent. We agree with this view and look forward to reviewing the final agreements on ABM treaty succession and TMD demarcation. Paragraph. To date, we have been encouraged by the administration's handling of the TMD demarcation issue. The U.S. proposal tabled at the Standing Consultative Commission, commonly known as the SCC,